Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our 87th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I am Maggie Vanderford, librarian for instruction and engagement. And as I mentioned, I am filling in for Angela, who is traveling, hence maybe some of the technical changes that we'll all get used to during today's episode of the Bookworm. But Angela deserves a break, so we will all make it through for her sake. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online. So this afternoon, you will receive an email with the recording and resources mentioned during today's broadcast. For comments and questions, some of you might not have access to chat everyone like you usually do. So you could also feel very free to put comments into the Q&A section as well, since we don't have the usual chat feature, and we'll be able to sort through those. So if there is anything pressing that you want to make sure you say or give your usual greetings to everyone, we're going to rely on the Q&A feature today. You can also ask questions for the panelists that we'll circle back to at the end of the conversation, or upvote other people's questions if you are particularly interested in something that's been asked. Please also note that there are live machine captions available, and you can toggle them on and off or change the size of these using the button that says transcript on your screen. And please note that side-by-side mode should allow you to see both the slides and the speaker at the same time. And if you're having any issues with this, just put a little note in the Q&A and we can go ahead and make things happen that way. So again, thank you for your patience with us. As if you're a regular attendee, you know, Angela is the master of all things Zoom for the Bookworm. So we are really grateful for your patience as we make our way through without her. I do want to note, for those of you who are perhaps new to the Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of the history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to 1900. We also, as such, want to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The Clements Library acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. I'm hoping that a few of you have had a little bit of time to take the poll, and I'm going to go ahead and close it. But I'm curious to see, and we wanted to ask this because we know some of you aren't necessarily local, but how many of you plan to see the Revolutionary Paine exhibit in person at the Clements? And it looks like there's a few of us who will be making our way into the library online, or both in person and online, and hopefully everybody will have a chance to see this really incredible and exciting exhibit in some capacity. The second question was one that is very specific to our topic of conversation today, which is how many copies of Common Sense does the Clements hold in its collections? And I'm actually going to hold off and let our curator of books, Emmy Hastings, answer that question in a little bit when she talks more in detail about the very exciting copies of Common Sense that the Clements has at the library. So we would also like to go ahead and thank Miriam Khan for sponsoring today's episode of the Bookworm. We are so grateful for your support, and we're excited for you to see the work that this Bookworm is going to make possible and available. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. I am joined today by Andy Murphy, who is the professor of political science and the department chair at the University of Michigan. Murphy's research takes up the intersections between politics and religion in both historical and contemporary contexts. He is particularly interested in the emergence of religious liberty and liberty of conscience in early modern England and America, and the ongoing ramifications of these debates as they continue to unsettle American politics. Also joining us this morning are two fourth-year students from Poli-Sci 495, which Professor Murphy taught in fall of 2025. The course was titled Revolutionary Political Thought in Early America and Beyond. And those two students are Arnav Gupta, who worked on case number 1 in the Revolutionary Paine exhibit, and Jerry Yang, who worked on case number 2. In addition, the curator of books and digital projects librarian, Emmy Hastings, will help frame today's discussion on Thomas Paine. So welcome to everybody. I'm excited to stop talking and hear more from all of you. Unfortunately, I do have to talk for one more minute because I want to frame sort of the context of today's conversation for you. Revolutionary Paine is now the 4th student-curated exhibit that the Clements has done, where we partner with a faculty member and a class on campus and give them really the agency to curate an exhibit that will be up in the cases for 4 to 5 months in this case. The students in Poli-Sci 495 did come this semester, and today we're going to have a conversation about our collaborative work. I do want to take a moment to explain what this exhibit is and encourage you all to view it in person or online. And we'll send the link, as we will all relevant resources, in the follow-up email today, since we don't have the chat going as actively as normal. But you can also easily find the exhibit by going to the Clements website and clicking the tab for online exhibits. The impetus for this exhibit came to be because the Clements holds a large number of copies of Common Sense. Again, Emmy will tell us more about this exact number when she talks about the publication history of this incredibly important early American publication. Common Sense was published on January 10th, 1776. So the timing of this is not an accident. This exhibit is launching in time with the 250th anniversary of the publication. And when it was published, Common Sense becomes most likely, I think any scholar would say, the most influential work of the American Revolution. Although scholars debate the exact number of copies that were eventually printed, there is no doubt that it was the most reprinted publication in the Revolutionary era. It's written and published by Thomas Paine, who is an English-born author and editor and political philosopher, among other identities. And this exhibit features some of our multiple copies of Paine's Common Sense, in addition to other materials that give context to Paine's life and legacy, which, as you will learn more about, becomes increasingly controversial over the course of his life. The first case in this exhibit is just that. It's some of our different editions of Common Sense that are meant to show just how viral and how infectious and important this early American pamphlet was. I'd like to turn the floor over to curator of books, Emmy Hastings, to tell us more about the work that she did to prepare for this exhibit, which included going through all of these various copies of the Clements canon of Common Sense. So could you share with us more about the publication history of Common Sense and the specific copies that are held here in the Clements collections?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, the early printing history of this text is quite complicated. So when we started planning for the exhibit, I pulled all of our copies of Common Sense to review them and update the catalog records to make sure that we knew exactly what we had in the collection. And the definitive reference work for this project is a book by Richard Gimble called Thomas Paine, A Bibliographical Checklist of Common Sense. So here's the page that lists all of the numbers of the different editions that he traced. So now I can say for certain we have 58 physical copies of Common Sense representing 54 different editions on this checklist. And they date from 1776 all the way up to 1880. So we really have a good representative sampling of the different imprints. And the first edition, as you mentioned, was published in Philadelphia in January 1776 by Robert Bell. And Paine wanted to stay anonymous at first, so there's no author name on the first edition, just Robert Bell's name. And Bell prints 1,000 copies of this pamphlet, and then it sells out in 2 weeks. So it's incredibly popular. And he and Paine had agreed to split the profits from this publication. But when Paine's friends went to pick up his share of the profits, Bell claimed that it had actually been so expensive to publish this pamphlet that there were no profits at all to share, which I think is a little suspicious. And then at the same time, after that first edition sold out, Paine wanted to update his text. He had some new material he wanted to share and add to his original pamphlet. So he claims that he told Bell to hold off and wait on printing any more copies until he'd had a chance to revise his text. But Bell claims that he didn't receive any such instructions, and he goes ahead with the second edition on his own. And he also takes the trouble to add written by an Englishman to the second edition, which is kind of a nod to the author's identity, which is still meant to be secret at this time. So this might have been sort of a passive aggressive dig as well. So Paine now is very upset about the lack of profit from this best-selling publication, and he's also upset about the unauthorized second printing. And so he takes his revised text to a different publisher in Philadelphia, the Bradfords. And they agree to print 6,000 copies of the new updated text, and they call it the new edition to distinguish it from Bell's first and second editions. And the new edition, they say, has substantial added material, increasing the work upwards of 1/3. So now Bell is really upset because the Bradfords are selling this new edition. They're undercutting his sales and calling his version unauthorized. And they're also offering the new edition at half the price of his. So they're really undermining his profits. So he publishes another pamphlet that he calls Large Additions to Common Sense, which is clearly implied to be a sequel written by Paine, but it's actually a compilation of pieces by other writers. And then, just to add insult to injury, he also copies all of Paine's new material from the Bradford edition and adds it to the end of this pamphlet. And then finally, Robert Bell issues what he calls the large edition of Common Sense. And so that has this original text that he printed, the added material that he just stole from the Bradford edition, and then that supposed sequel that he concocted. So as you can imagine, bibliographically, this is just all really complicated if you want to know, what is the definitive version of this text. Usually we would think of the first edition as being the closest to the author's original intention. But then in this case, if you know that there's this new edition published by the Bradfords that has the revised text, so maybe that's closer to what Paine wanted to share. But then on the other hand, if you're just looking at page count, you might think that Bell's large edition is the most complete version of the text, unless you know that some of that material at the end was not actually written by Paine. And part of the reason that we know so much about this printing history is that all of this controversy is extensively covered by the newspapers in Philadelphia. So multiple times a week in at least 4 different newspapers, readers are seeing competing ads for the different editions. They're seeing editorials by Bell, the Bradfords, and Paine, all explaining their version of events. And so here's an example from one newspaper, the Pennsylvania Evening Post, where the 2 ads for the 2 different versions are side by side on the back page of the newspaper. So you see the second edition by Bell on the left, the Bradford edition on the right, and they're both giving their version of the story. Paine says that Bell tried to cheat him of his rightful profits. He claims that he had intended to use his share of the money to buy mittens for the American soldiers. So now Bell looks like he doesn't support the troops. And then Bell, on the other hand, is portraying himself as this honest, hardworking printer who's just being unjustly attacked by this totally unreasonable author. And he says that at least he had the manly fortitude to put his name on the title page, unlike Mr. Anonymous. And he does put this in quotes. And he also calls him a rascally puppy and a wretched reptile. So they're getting pretty heated in the news coverage here. And this newspaper is actually only 4 pages long. So this is a quarter of the newspaper being dedicated to this one publication. And I think ultimately, despite all the name calling and back and forth, this is really a dispute about who owns the text once it's printed. And Bell is operating on a traditional British understanding of copyright, which is that the publisher of the first edition has the right to print any subsequent copies, literally the copyright. And Paine is trying to articulate a newer concept of essentially intellectual property. He has the idea that the author should control what happens to their work and they have the right to profit from it. But there is no American copyright law yet. And so Paine ultimately ends up making no profit at all, even though his book is a bestseller. And in fact, he ends up saying that he was out of pocket 39 pounds and 11 shillings from the whole thing. Um, but I do think ultimately, despite all of this, the free publicity of all this additional newspaper coverage, this is way more than the coverage for an average publication of this time. And I think that probably contributed to the public interest in this text and the increased sales numbers, and then helped this text to spread further than it might otherwise have done. And so if we look at where Common Sense was printed before 1800, it starts, of course, with the different editions in Philadelphia, and then it spreads outwards along the mail routes as people are mailing it to their friends, and then it gets reprinted by other printers in other local towns. Mostly it's centered in the New England region, although there is one known edition in South Carolina, and then there were also excerpts printed in newspapers, so people who didn't have access to the full text might still see snippets of it in their local papers. And then the text travels across the Atlantic to be reprinted in London, other locations in the UK, and also translated into French and German for new audiences. And one thing that's kind of interesting is that the London publisher, John Allman, chooses to issue Common Sense bundled together with another pamphlet that he prints, which is representing the opposing viewpoint, Plain Truth by James Chalmers. And so London readers could have both sides of the argument together in one volume. And then the other kind of interesting thing about the London editions is that certain words or phrases that Paine used in his original text could be considered seditious libel against the king. And so John Almond opts to black out or blank out those passages in the text. So literally just leaving blank spots where that text would have appeared in order to avoid prosecution. But as you can see from this particular copy, some of the copies have had the blanks filled in by hand. So we can see that that text was still circulating in some form in London despite that censorship. So that's just a bit of context to explain some of the editions that we selected for that first case and why we have collected so many copies of Common Sense in this library.
Thank you so much, Emmy. That's all such important background, and that's the perspective that the Clements is coming from when we think of these collaborations. But in order to collaborate in this way, we need to partner with a faculty member. And so for this particular student-curated exhibit, we were really lucky to partner with Andy Murphy. And Andy, I'm hoping that you can share a bit more about your own academic and professional background and the type of teaching that you do. How did this partnership with the Clements come about from your perspective?
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, as you mentioned a minute ago, Maggie, I have a long-standing interest in the relationship between religion and politics, more particularly in the emergence of religious liberty. And I've written a lot about William Penn and the founding of Pennsylvania and the way that that sort of figures into the broader sort of settlement and founding of this country. Paine, of course, arrives in Philadelphia when he comes to America in 1774, and so this was very much something that was sort of in my wheelhouse. And I knew a bit about Paine generally, but I hadn't done this kind of deep dive. So in terms of my teaching, I often teach a course in early American political thought, which focuses on the Revolution up through the Civil War. And Common Sense is always on the syllabus. It's a go-to. It never rotates out. And I also teach a modern political theory course where Paine's Rights of Man, which is his work defending the French Revolution, is again sort of a staple. And so I've never actually taught both of those works in the same course. But this was a chance to kind of see what would happen if we took Paine as the kind of through line. And working with the Clements was it was a suggestion that came to me from Paul Erickson, the director, but I didn't need to be asked twice. We worked with you on a previous class, doing some work on the papers of Frederick Douglass, which wasn't really an exhibit, but it was just something where the students came over. And so this struck me as sort of the logical next step to sort of develop a kind of relationship that had a kind of concrete public-facing payout. So really looking forward to the exhibit and talking about it.
I know you mentioned that for this particular class, pain is the through line, but can you talk a little bit more about the overarching concept of the class and how the exhibit project fit into your syllabus? It certainly requires a different kind of work, both from you and the students, really, in
Mhm.
thinking about course design in this way.
Right. Well, one of the things to say, and I think we'll mention this when we bring the students in, is that it was very clearly noted to the students that the class would involve this kind of work. So no one was surprised. It wasn't a bait and switch. But as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of attention this around now to the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, conferences and speakers and events, and that's really important. And I would never say anything to minimize the importance. But I also would sometimes say to the students, it's possible that if there's no common sense, first in January, there's no Declaration of Independence in July. I don't know if I really truly believe that. That's a strong version of the argument, but certainly I would say you can't tell the story of the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776 without paying a lot of attention to the publication of Common Sense in January of 1776. So what we did, and you also can't, I think, fully understand the Declaration and its importance without understanding the broader revolutionary time period of the latter decades of the 18th century. So the Declaration becomes part of the story of the French Revolution as well. The French are the French government, for its own reasons, supports the American Revolution. So the revolution is part of a larger revolutionary process, and Paine is deeply involved in both of those, in each of those revolutions, America and in France. And that's sort of what gave the class its shape. We spent about half the class with Paine in the American Revolution and his context, and half with Paine in the French Revolution and that context.
That's really helpful framing. Thank you so much, Andy.
Mhm.
I want to hand the metaphorical microphone over to Arnav and Jerry. And as students in the class, I'd love if you could tell us first a little bit about yourselves and what you're interested in and what you do. And then I'd also like to hear about how you decided to take this class and a little bit more about what you hoped to learn from it. As Andy has already mentioned, there was some description in the little course summary that you chose on the website that explained that you would be curating an exhibit for the Clements. But you might not have known anything about the Clements in the first place. So I'd also love if you could tell us what did you expect or understand about the Clements before this class? Arnav, let's go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, sure. So, I had never really had this opportunity before, now that I'm a senior at UM to, curate an exhibit. And so when I saw this opportunity, when I was registering for classes, I kind of just jumped at it. And, as someone whose major is focused so heavily on political science and history, and as someone who's very interested in American history on a personal level, the ability to learn about something like this in this kind of way where I would be curating an exhibit was super interesting to me. Um, and you're right. I mean, the Clements Library, everyone knows about it here at UM, but I had never really been inside before. You kind of walk past this really cool looking building with a glass entrance every day, but you don't really know what goes on inside. And so the ability to go in and learn about what the Clements is, which to me uh, is this exceptional way to learn from, firsthand materials, very historical documents. And as students, the ability to access those and handle them yourselves was very, very special to me. And it opened my eyes to see how just interacting with materials in that way can be such an immense tool for learning. And so the Clements was monumental in not only teaching me about this period of time, which I was so interested in, but giving me more knowledge in handling these materials. And I really enjoyed the class.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Arnav. And I promise we did not pay you money to say any of those things. So the episode is sponsored, but you guys are not. So we appreciate it. Jerry, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about your experiences before, during, and after the class.
Yeah, I think as Professor Murphy said, a lot of us took this class because we saw that we are going to be working with the Clements Library to set up an exhibit. So going into the fall semester, going to last semester, I was looking for a class that was small in size and that featured a non-traditional work environment, right? Because a lot of our classes, pretty much all of my political science classes, were these big lecture hall classes that you don't get this small group work environment. And as someone who loves studying political theory, I think this class was a perfect combination of all three. I think the effect that this has is that it allows a much higher quality of education, both in the classroom and both at the Clements Library. In the classroom, I think everyone got to contribute something new, or if they wanted to contribute something every time, and get to like have this one-on-one experience with Professor Murphy that you don't get with like a 400-person lecture hall class. And at the Clemens Library, I think the faculty members were all very, very helpful, and we all received individualized supports if we wanted to. I think I remember the first day that I went to the Clemens Library and started working with the staff. I'd stayed over with another student for 20 minutes after the class, just receiving feedback on this one item. So I think in that sense, having this small collaborative work environment was really helpful in supplementing traditional in-classroom teachings. And about the Clemens Library, I agree. I've never been into the Clemens Library. I've always walked past it. It was this big, mysterious building that I wasn't even sure was a library. So I had no idea what was inside. So the first time that I went inside for the tour at the beginning of the semester, it absolutely blew my mind. It was beautiful. The resources were insane. There were so many opportunities that we as students had access to that we normally wouldn't have. So we really appreciate this opportunity to work with the Clemens Library and to have our work be on display.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And it's funny, you mentioned that 24 students is a pretty small group in the grand scheme of classes that you take at the University of Michigan. But for us, that's actually a pretty big class. Our instruction space kind of comfortably fits about 20 to 25. So this is a big effort for us. And the other thing I want to mention in terms of how student-curated exhibits work is that there is sort of a delicate balance between giving the class initiative and agency to take in curating an exhibit while making sure that that's not necessarily overwhelming. It's a lot to look at, not just all of the 58 edition or 58 copies of Common Sense that we have and whittle down from there to the most interesting ones for display, but then to figure out how to put together the sort of thematic threads of the rest of the exhibit. So before the semester started, Andy and I and conservator Julie Freemuth, who is important in every step of putting an exhibit together, but especially the planning of it at the beginning, decided that we would go ahead and create sort of a chronological scope for the exhibit that would mirror what Professor Murphy's syllabus looked like. So as we've already mentioned, case one covered a few different editions of Common Sense to give a representative sample of just how viral and important this text was. The second case features responses to and comments on Common Sense. Case three features materials related to Paine's later work, The Rights of Man, and some of his work around the French Revolution, as well as responses to that work. And case four demonstrates just how controversial the latter chapters of Paine's life were, which we will get into a little bit later in the conversation. So students very much had control of what would go on display. We gave them some items to choose from, but it was up to them to choose what went in the cases. At the end of the day, they wrote the caption text for both the physical booklet that goes with the in-person cases and the online exhibit. And they also had the choice when it came to how they wanted to display the material. What page should a book be open to? All of those details were very much out of our hands, which is not typical for a Clements Library exhibit. Andy, I want to ask you, what surprised you about the class in the course of planning it? And did you learn anything yourself about the way exhibits work at archives like this that also maybe surprised or compelled you?
Well, I did. One thing that didn't surprise me was how the students just dove in. I mean, I wish everyone who's with us this morning could have seen some of our work sessions where the students were just all in to the point where, and they had to, as you were just saying, they had to sometimes whittle down 7 or 8 possible things to fit into a display case to 4 or 5. And there were serious discussions, we'll say, amongst the groups, offering arguments here and there. But I will say that didn't surprise me because I taught Michigan students before, and I knew that they were going to dive into it. One of the things that did surprise me, because I've spent a lot of time in archives in my own work, the work I've done on William Penn or on Pennsylvania or religious freedom, but as a researcher, sitting in the reading room, getting materials from the archive and then working through them for my own work. I haven't really been involved in the creation of an the creation of an exhibit at an archival library. Often, if I'm at the library, there's a great exhibit. My lunch break, I'll go over and look at it. But actually, to be involved in the very nitty-gritty, hands-on questions of not just what's going to go into the case, but also how are you, and you talked about Julie, how are you going to display it? You don't just put the book in the case, and maybe Arnav and Jerry will talk about this too. You just put the book in the case. It's just a book sitting in the case. You open it up in some way so that people who are looking at the case will be able to see it. Well, then what page do you open it to, and why? And so all the decisions that go into the successful mounting of an exhibit that happen way before anybody even comes into the room. I guess I knew it sort of in my head, but to actually be part of it was really amazing.
I'd love to spend a little bit of time hearing from Arnav and hearing from Jerry about the cases that their group worked on. And for background, with 24 students, it makes the most sense to split them up into groups, and each group worked on a specific case. And within that group, each student worked on and was responsible for a specific item that they researched, wrote the captions for, and in conversation with their group and in conversation with the class, made choices about in terms of display or additional elements that they wanted to include in the exhibit, and any of those sort of additional features. So Arnav and Jerry, I'd like to ask you to just describe your group's case focuses and your own individual research projects with the materials in the case. If you could explain a little bit about that material, and also each case really was different and had different challenges associated with it. So if you could talk through some of the pleasures and or challenges of working on the material in your specific case, that would be great. Let's start with Arnav again.
Yeah, so I was in the group that worked on case one, and case one primarily focused on the differences in the various editions of Common Sense as it progressed through time. And so, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the four editions that we mainly focused on were the first Bell edition from January 10th in 1776, the Bradford edition in February of 1776, the Alman London edition from June of 1776, and then we focused on a French edition from 1791. And so the challenge for us in this case was, we have these four editions of Common Sense, but how do we make this interesting in an exhibition case? Um, and so what we decided to do was focus on the subtle differences between each of the publications and try to highlight how each edition was a little bit different from the other. And so between the Bell edition and the Bradford edition, we focused on the publishing page and how and highlighted the dispute and how the publishers have changed. When we looked at the Alman edition, which was my research focus, we looked at the censorship and how readers were filling in the censored pages by hand. And what we really wanted to focus on with the Alman edition was how Paine's readers found a way to present his entire text, in a sense, fighting that oppression. And what we did in the case was focus on specific quotes, which you guys will see if you when you go and attend the exhibit, specific quotes which the publisher thought were necessary to remove. And you would see a similar trend in those quotes and why you think the publisher thought it was necessary. Um, so there was stuff like that which we had to really grapple with as we were trying to determine what fits well, um, and how to really arrange them nicely in the case. And I'd say overall, when working with this project, the challenge was also for our first time learning how to handle these materials. I mean, these are very rare books. They're super old. We had never really had experience with this kind of stuff before. And so we had to learn and, adapt to that learning curve. It was a pleasure as well. I mean, I had never really handled these books before, but it required some focus and some concentration. And it was truly a pleasurable experience in that way.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that overview, Arnav. Jerry, do you want to tell us about case two?
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of working on case two, which has a Latin title, but it literally translates to "listen to the other side," and it's all about the counters to common sense and the loyalists and the British positions. Our case consisted of four different items. One of them was a portrait of Tom Paine. The second one was a political cartoon depicting Thomas Paine as this evil doctor trying to feed the medicine of independence to all the colonists. The third one was Charles Inglis's True Interest of America, and the fourth one is which I worked on is James Chalmers's Plain Truth. And I think the biggest challenge of working on case two was finding the historical information and the supporting data for all of the relevant items. Because in case one, you have a lot of common sense additions, and common sense remained a influential text even after the war, right? And it's even an influential text throughout today in American society. But for case two, you have these isolated these texts that are influential in 1 or 2 years, right? After the war ended, after the British lost, they lost their influence just because they didn't have a place in American society anymore. So a lot of the information about them faded into obscurity and faded within time. So working on, for my item, working on Plain Truth by James Chalmers, for example, James Chalmers wasn't attributed as the author of Plain Truth until 1951, just because the book got lost in time. So I think it's a lot about a lot of things like that, trying to find the supplementing details, trying to dig through history and find out what this book was about, what this book was written for, and who wrote it. That presented itself as a big challenge. I think another one is trying to find the physical layouts that was best suited the case and exhibits. As Professor Murphy said, that this isn't just like an essay that we had to write using these four items. We had to think about where we wanted to position these items, how we wanted to display them, which orientation we wanted to display them, and which page we wanted each book to be opened up to. I think that was a unique challenge that none of us really expected. I think another unintended side effect of working on this exhibit in particular is that a lot of us started to really, as we read these loyalist books, we started to believe in these loyalist arguments, and it made more and more sense as the semester progressed. I think by the end of the semester, I think most, if not everyone working on case two, became to an extent a loyalist. And really believed the arguments that Chalmers and Inglis wrote, which was a very interesting side effect. But overall, it was a really interesting and insightful project to work on.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Yes, and the conversion of students to a loyalist was not one of our stated course objectives. So we were just as surprised as everybody in the presentations when all of a sudden it seemed like you were kind of on board with Charles Inglis and with Inglis and Chalmers. Unfortunately, we don't have any students from case three and case four with us today. So Andy and I are just going to give really brief summaries that are not as eloquent as what Arnav and Jerry have done, but we want to explain how the rest of the exhibit unfolds. Case three pivots to 15 years after the publication of Common Sense, when Paine publishes the first part of Rights of Man, which is both a defense of the French Revolution and a critique of Edmund Burke's also extremely popular 1790 Reflections on the Revolution in France, which critiqued French revolutionaries and defended sort of traditional established political norms and institutions. So the publication of Burke's Reflections inspired not only Paine, but as you can imagine, plenty of other English and American authors writing back to him, including Mary Wollstonecraft. So as you see in this picture, the first grouping in this case is that little trio of Paine, Burke, and Wollstonecraft in conversation. We also were very lucky to be able to have a piece on loan for this exhibit from a private collector, Roger Genser, who loaned us a print called Contrasted Opinions of Paine's Pamphlet, which is a caricature that features little engravings of Paine and Burke and Wollstonecraft and George III and Queen Charlotte, all giving their reactions to Paine's Rights of Man, and assembles sort of key political figures that articulate a range of reactions to the rights of man. And the case ends with John Quincy Adams' 1793 response to Rights of Man, which is another text that we put in there that kind of aims to show the ways in which this resonated on both sides of the Atlantic. And Adams is certainly respectful of Paine's legacy, I think you would say, and his role in the American Revolution. But Adams also thinks that his defense of events in France is dangerously radical. And this case felt to us like a little bit of a pivot where we see Paine go from this sort of stock American revolutionary hero to starting to take on a more complex legacy that will play out in case 4 as well. Andy, would you like to talk us through what happens in case 4 to conclude our chronology here?
Sure. Case 4 is called an uncommon conclusion, a little nice play on words from common sense to an uncommon conclusion. But it deals with the legacy of Paine beyond these two important political works. It starts with Paine's 1794 critique of organized religion and celebration of deism, the Age of Reason. And I think it's useful to mention here what Jerry was saying about students becoming convinced of loyalism, or at least seeing the logic of the arguments. It's easy to forget, I think, just how radical an idea Paine was putting forward in something like American independence. It's something that at the time struck many people as unthinkable and at best counterintuitive. The religious dimension, the more specifically religious dimension of Paine's radicalism, comes out in The Age of Reason. There's also a transcript, a bit from a transcript of Richard Carlile from 1819, who was prosecuted for publishing The Age of Reason, prosecuted for blasphemy and seditious libel. So the radicalism of Paine in the political realm is one piece of the story, and the radicalism of Paine in the religious realm is another piece of the story. There's also a really interesting manuscript, a handwritten manuscript, a letter to the editor that was written, a sort of a satirical attack on Paine's death, accusing Paine by an anonymous writer, we don't know who it was, accusing Paine of hypocrisy, for calling out to God on his deathbed, since of course everyone knew he was an atheist, even though Paine claimed not to be an atheist. And then the last piece is this really remarkable a book called Light from the Spirit World, 1852. So again, here, Paine dies in 1809, so we're years beyond his death, but it's a spiritualist story about connecting with Paine's spirit after death and his reflection on his legacy. By the time he died, he was widely reviled, but his legacy continues and continues to be sort of a central part of the story of the 18th century age of revolution. So the 4th case kind of brings that all beyond Paine himself to the larger story.
Thank you so much, Andy. So that's it. Those are the 4 cases. I want to emphasize that for us, this kind of work is really important. Usually when you go see an exhibit at a museum or a library, there might be a guest curator, right? There might be some things on loan, but very often the work that you see is done, at least in part, by people who work at that institution. So for us, putting these materials in the voices of students, I think really matters. It might not be the exact wording we would use to describe something, or, they might read things in a different way. And I do also want to say we were overruled by the students on certain decisions throughout the curation of this exhibit. And I think that's important too. So when you come see it, you are seeing different voices than the ones that you usually would see from Clements Library staff. Arnav and Jerry, I also want to ask you what this experience was like for you, because it's different than writing a paper that only Professor Murphy will see at the end of the semester. Meeting deadlines is different. If you're late a day, that affects an entire library and people's jobs and the way they're working. So what was this experience like for you as students? And what sort of challenges did you anticipate in terms of translating this subject matter and these conversations on Paine into not just work for a class, but into a public-facing exhibit with the Clements? Arnav, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and everyone in the class was so excited to get started. But one thing we had to quickly come to terms with was the things that we are submitting, as part of our quote unquote assignments, are going to be viewed by so many other people. And that's not something that you immediately realize. The weight of that hits you later. And so, as we were coming to terms with that and grappling with that, working with people at the Clements was so helpful. And so, in my case in particular, it is a very interesting case, don't get me wrong, but at its core, it is just four editions of common sense. And so we were thinking about, what's the best way to make this interesting for viewers who are going to come and look at this case. And so in dealing with that issue and working with people at the Clements, we decided on a very beautiful backdrop, which makes our case a little bit more interesting compared to the rest. And that's not something that we would have that's not a solution we would have reached on our own. Right. So it's stuff like that where, you go into it not really understanding the weight. And then when you do, trying to think about how you're submitting your assignments and approaching your tasks in a way which not only suit what you think might be best, but what the public might think is best. And so that was both a challenge and a very cool like intellectual puzzle which we were grappling with as students in the class.
Thanks, Arnav. Jerry?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think it boils down to responsibility for me. Because as you said earlier, this isn't just an assignment or a class where everything we submit is just going to be viewed by Dr. Murphy. So we need to be intentional about what we do, and we need to take responsibility and accountability in the things that we do. And translating this into the coursework, that meant for me with the caption writing assignments, if this was any other class, if my assignment was just to be viewed by Dr. Murphy, I probably would have spent like 30 minutes on it, no offense to Dr. Murphy, and submitted it and turned it in. And that was that and called it a day. But because I knew, and I think we all knew that our work would be viewed by hundreds, thousands of people, hopefully, we needed to make sure that our work was double checked, just beyond what the standard is. So I probably spent way too much time. I spent like 2 hours trying to perfect every word, trying to make sure that the audience knows the context in which the item took place in. And I think it's small details like that that we don't normally pay attention to in a normal class setting that we need to be on top of and we need to double check and triple check. Because at the end of the day, we are representing the university and the Clements Library to an extent, and the work we do needs to be up to that standard.
No offense, Dr. Murphy, but I think we found the only way to get students to spend time on your assignments, apparently.
I'll take it.
Yeah, we'll do it for sure. Okay, so in conclusion, and then I want to pivot to questions because it looks like we have lots of good ones in the Q&A, and I hope more are added. But before we finish, I want to just hear from each of you, Andy, Arnav, and Jerry. In your opinion, what will viewers learn about when they come to see the exhibit? What are some of the main highlights or takeaways of the experience from your perspective? And I guess the easiest way to put this too is why should people come see it? Convince the people to come see all of your hard work. Arnav, why don't we start with you again, and then we'll go to Andy and then Jerry.
Yeah. So my advice is for, anyone coming to view the case, either in person or virtually, um, is to kind of approach it from the perspective of not knowing who won. And I know that might be a little bit difficult. We all have the benefit in hindsight of knowing who won. But it served, especially for me, as a huge learning experience, trying to approach it and addressing each of the materials as not really knowing how the revolutionary period turned out. Um, and it opens up a different perspective of learning and a different perspective of how you're able to approach each of the materials throughout the exhibit. Um, very broadly, the goal of this exhibit is to portray how much of an impact Thomas Paine had, both on his readers and his critics, politically and culturally. Um, because Thomas Paine might not be the first person you think of when you think of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And so that would be my advice is to kind of approach it with a completely open mind. Uh, don't let your current knowledge kind of hinder how much you're able to take away from the exhibit. And I think you'll learn a lot about Paine and his work.
Perfect, thank you. And Andy, what about you?
I would just say that it gives to me the big takeaway from the exhibit is that it puts everything that we think of as important about our own revolutionary history into a bigger context. So it's not simply that we're talking about common sense. So that's where the audience members or viewers will start. But it then pulls back to the bigger picture, first with Paine's critics in America, then with Paine's involvement in the French Revolution and so on. So it gives an opportunity for people to understand what happened in this country in 1776, 250 years ago, this year, in context of what was happening in other times and places in the same general sort of historical neighborhood. And so I think you really get a more nuanced and contextualized view of the American Revolution through the lens of this one individual.
Perfect. And Jerry?
I think the most important thing when coming to visit this exhibit is thinking of Thomas Paine as more than the person that wrote Common Sense. Because I think we all started class just knowing that Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense and that's all he was. But he's so much more. I think as we get later and later into his life, as you get to Exhibit 3 and Exhibit 4, that's when the really interesting things about Thomas Paine comes out, that he was a religious scholar and that he became pretty radicalized at the end of his life. I think it's just getting this more comprehensive and holistic overview of who Thomas Paine was as more than just a generic patriot and the writer of Common Sense will be the most interesting for viewers.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I hope that for all of you who might not be able to come see the exhibit in person, this overview was helpful, but please join me in thanking our speakers, Andy and Jerry and Arnav. I want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we move to questions for them, but please keep in mind that you can enter any questions into the Q&A, and we will get through as many as we can. As I've mentioned, today is the opening day of the Revolutionary Paine Student-Curated exhibit. You can visit it in person from noon to 4, Monday through Friday, or you can view it online. For those of you who are interested in learning more about the Clements in general, you can also join us for a tour on Friday, January 23rd at 4 p.m. To register, just access the link that Katie will put into the chat. The Office of Academic Multicultural Initiatives here at the University of Michigan is also hosting events throughout the month of January to recognize the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You can learn more by visiting their website, to which we will share a link in the chat. The Clements Library, the University of Michigan Library, Special Collections Research Center, and the US at 250 initiative invite you to join the first lecture in a 3-part series titled Drinking the Revolution, exploring the role of beverages in revolutionary America and the early republic. So if you want to come see what Tom Paine was indulging in between writing all of these important texts, this is a great opportunity. Jordan B. Smith, Assistant Professor of History at Widener University, will open the series with a discussion of his book, The Invention of Rum, Creating the Quintessential Atlantic Commodity, on Thursday, January 22nd at 4 p.m. in the Hatcher Gallery. Prize-winning scholar and renowned author of Black history, Martha Jones, will join next month's Bookworm for a conversation on identity, belonging, and family, drawing from her powerful new book, The Trouble with Color, an American Family Memoir. And to conclude, we would once again just like to thank Miriam Khan so much for sponsoring today's episode of The Bookworm. We're really grateful for your support, and hopefully all of you have gotten to see what I am lucky enough to see every day in my job as the librarian for instruction. The students at the University of Michigan are bright and amazing and creative and thoughtful, and sponsoring this episode of The Bookworm gave us the chance to hear directly from them, which I think is so important. So thank you, Miriam. And if you are interested in sponsoring a future episode of The Bookworm, please let me know. Thank you all for being part of the Bookworm community through your participation. And thank you especially today for your patience with our technical difficulties. I promise next month Angela will be back and it will all just be as smooth as it can possibly be. So I'm going to get to the questions, and I am so excited to see that there are so many really good ones in here. I'm not sure that we'll have time to get to all of them, but I'm going to try to get to as many as we possibly can. There are quite a few relating to the publication history of Common Sense, Emmy, so I want to put you back on the spot and ask you some of those. At what point, Bob Acker asks, in the publication history did Paine's name appear on the editions? Do you know off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think it was 1791 where his name starts to appear. But as far as I can tell, it was kind of an open secret before then. So I imagine a lot of people knew before that date.
A long time afterwards, but I think you're right. I think that is likely just the print version of that story. Miriam Khan asks a really good question as well. Would you talk more about the secondary sources you use to learn about Paine and his publications? And Emmy, I actually do want to start with you because you had to find ones specific to Paine and print history. But then Andy and Arnav and Jerry, I'd love to hear from you about how you filled in the gaps in your Paine research in the various areas. But Emmy, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, kind of the definitive checklist of common sense editions is Richard Gimbel's checklist of common sense. And that is the full text is available on HathiTrust, so we can share that link as part of the resources. And then the other secondary sources that I found particularly helpful were Trish Luffren's The Republic in Print, Michael J. Everton's The Grand Chorus of Complaint, and Philip Gould's Writing the Rebellion. And those all gave some helpful context as to the printing history, some of that, the copyright legality stuff. And I also spent quite a bit of time with our newspaper collection, hunting down all of these articles that mention common sense or the advertisements for it in these different papers. And I found that very informative as well.
Andy, I imagine you had to do a little digging as you were putting the syllabus together. Do you have any sources you want to mention in
Well,
particular?
I want to defer to the students, but I will say this, in terms of the course itself, our seminar was almost entirely primary sources because I really wanted the students to engage with the 18th century texts, so Paine and his critics. But I think they'll probably say, if when we turn it over to them, that depending on what their particular item was, they had to do that work themselves, often in conjunction with Emmy and Julie and yourself. That they were sort of responsible for running down the things that would give them the information that they needed on the particular piece they were working on. So maybe I'll invite them to share anything they have to say.
Yeah, so for my case in particular, and I mentioned earlier, I focused primarily on the London Alman edition, which had censored portions. The tough part for us was to figure out what exactly was being cut out because you're trying to read this edition, and there's just so many sections of the pages cut out, and so. For us, I mean, we primarily just used the Dover Thrift edition of Common Sense, which we were reading together in class, and kind of aligning those pages and seeing what exact quotes were taken out and trying to identify them for the class. And so, since we were focusing primarily on each edition, we didn't have much research in terms of secondary sources, but we did have to do some of our own research in terms of figuring out exact quotes.
For me, I think there's a wide range of sources, that secondary sources for each of our items. I know for someone else's item in our group, she had the poster, the political cartoon for Thomas Paine, and that was just one isolated source. She could not find any secondary sources, so she literally had to look at the binding and the creases around the edge of the object to determine where it came from, and its manufacturing history. But for me, when I did Plain Truth. I think I found, I think, two or three secondary sources and scholars who actually studied plain truth. So it was a lot of relying on that and referencing the main text and the primary text of plain truth and and using those two texts in conjunction to come up with an answer.
You're right, Jerry. There are pros and cons to using incredibly rare material for exhibits. The pro is that you won't be able to see that anywhere, but the con is, yeah, you have to really do some boots on the ground research to be able to write a useful caption about it and do reading of the object itself, not just the secondary sources you can find. Andy, John Paris says that my son is a junior and doing a history minor. How can he take a class like this next fall? And can his retired dad come too? Also, and the answer, of course, sadly, is that I'm not. There will be a class like this next fall, but we're not sure exactly what yet. So we'll have to keep an eye on the course catalog. But he does say, can you let me know what classes Professor Murphy teaches where Payne's work is taught? So maybe you can still do a little recruiting.
Right. Well, since I became the department chair, I don't teach as much as I used to because I end up spending a lot of time in meetings. But we do have courses on early American political thought. We have courses in modern political thought, and Paine is very central to both of those. I'm not sure whether this particular class will actually ever be taught again. It was very much of a great opportunity. I mean, it was a wonderful course. I would teach it again in a moment, but it wouldn't have the museum, the library sort of component to it. So, but there are lots of ways you can engage with Paine and sort of the early American context here on campus in the history department, as well as in the political theory courses.
Um, Emmy, I really love this question from John Woodford, and I'm curious how you would answer it. Tell us about some of the issues that the publisher's decisions revealed specifically: ideological concerns, commercial concerns about fines or arrests. Did their place of residence affect the choices they made? Are there any other tidbits about the publishing history or the history of the publishers that you can give us some insight into?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as we mentioned, the London editions are the ones that really show that direct evidence of censorship, or at least anticipated censorship, where there is a real concern that that particular publisher, John Allman, had already been arrested and served time for seditious libel before. So he was probably as cautious as possible in avoiding that. The American publishers, I don't think they had that fear. They seem to have been pretty free in putting their names on the title pages and not worrying about that. And I think their concerns were maybe more on the commercial side as to, they're trying to meet this demand for this publication that's selling like hotcakes. How can they get it into print as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible in order to meet that audience. And so you see publishers making decisions like using a smaller typeface, cheaper paper. I think, one publisher is so short on paper that they end up splitting it into two different editions. So there's a part one and a part two because they had to scrounge up more paper for the second part. So a lot of it comes down to just, kind of the commercial realities of printing and bookselling as a business. And Robert Bell actually touches on this in his arguments with the Bradfords. He says that, his edition might be twice as expensive, but it's also better printed on better quality paper. The Bradford edition you will find is, very shabby type, tiny print, bad paper, and that's why it's cheaper.
Bad paper.
Could I add one thing,
Yeah,
Maggie?
yeah.
The third edition, which we mentioned earlier, in terms of the new material that was added, was really important, and that's the edition we had in class, because it included this appendix, which was sort of an all-out attack on Quakers, who were, of course, pacifist during the Revolution and were considered to be loyalists. So that was one sort of piece, I think, that's part of, and Emmy was really helpful in helping us kind of understand all this. That's that one new piece of material that goes in as the publishing history unfolds, that really was important for us to understand the political context in Philadelphia when he published it.
Thank you so much. Andy, and then Arnav and Jerry, I'm curious how this question from Bruce Flynn came up for you over the course of your discussions in the class. Bruce says, what I gather from this presentation is that Paine's ideas about freedom became increasingly quote unquote radical over time post-American Revolution. But did he really become more radical, or did the American consciousness become more conservative as the country strove to protect its newfound independence? How would you answer that question? Maybe we'll start with you, Andy, and then Arnav and Jerry, since you did really kind of read this arc as the way your syllabus was constructed.
Well, I think Paine would claim that he didn't change and that he was consistent the whole time. It's interesting because in some ways, the John Quincy Adams piece that you mentioned, Maggie, in case 3 is a really interesting example. And I think what we see is that the revolutionary movement in this country was a coalition. People who were maybe on the more cautious and conservative side, but still in favor, ranging. So John Adams, John Quincy's father, and Paine had a very frosty relationship. Adams was concerned about disorder and things like that, though they were both on the same side of the revolution. So what happens after you have a successful revolution is that you see Paine's sort of work as being a useful historical reference, but maybe not so welcome in the new society. So I think that the way you describe that piece is there's a kind of deference to Paine as an important figure in the movement, but also a worry that if these things get taken too far, they can undermine and upset the apple cart. So I don't know whether we can say that the American people became more conservative, but certainly they had the idea that their revolution was done, and they had work to do, and the French thing was sort of a worrisome possible way in which those things could keep coming back.
Arnav and Jerry, do you have anything you want to add from discussions you had in class or anything else that comes to mind from your own work on Paine?
Yeah, something I'll mention briefly is since my case focused primarily on the print history of common sense, um, what it really highlighted to us, especially, is that his views were considered to be somewhat radical in the sense that they contributed immensely to his popularity. And what surprised us the most about that was seeing how quickly it expanded beyond the United States and America and internationally in places like London and France. And so even for something like Common Sense, we were just really impressed with how well it spread and how international its presence was. And which gave us a lot of insight into how people might have viewed his positions as out of the ordinary and a little bit radical at that time.
Thanks, Arnav. Oh, go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, the way that I view it is that I don't think Thomas Paine really changed in terms of radicalism, but really shifted his platform from these political attacks to these religious attacks. I think he is radical in both senses, but people were fine with him making these bold statements against the monarch because that's what everyone was doing at that time, and everyone joined on. But once he, I think, in the Age of Reason, once he turned against more conventional religious ideology, people started attacking him more and more. And with every piece he writes about the Quakers, he's basically he's very radical, I think, in that sense. And once it shifted to a once he started attacking religious freedom, people just turned against him.
I'm going to finish with this question, even though there are more in the chat, but I hope that if we didn't get to your question today, you can email us if you'd still like it answered, and we would be really happy to pass it along to Professor Murphy and the students. But I love Tom Wagner's question. Would some of Paine's political positions not be popular today? And Andy and Arnav and Jerry, I want to ask you that, in part because of the conversation that we had about the sort of loyalist conversion. And I think, we're sort of joking about that, sort of not, but I think something that really came up, at least for me in this class, was the way in which engaging with primary sources forced the students to think about the logic of how political arguments are made and what is persuasive and what is not. And when you really take a step back to conclusions and pretend that they, haven't already been made, how can you put yourself in the position of people trying to make decisions about who to believe and what to think, just like they are today? So that's my framing for this question, and I think it's a good one to end on. So maybe Andy and Arnav and Jerry, you could answer sort of to the best of your ability in a way that asks you to be theoretical about what would happen if Paine were alive today. But what would people think of his politics? Who would he be in this landscape? Andy, does anything come to mind for you? I know.
Well, sure. We did talk a bit about this. Much of our class discussions were very much focused on what was happening at the time and who was arguing with whom. But one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about is there are common sense and rights of man both are kind of like a grab bag. I mean, Paine is a polemicist. He's trying to persuade people to take one side of an issue and not the other. And so he's going to throw everything he can, every argument he can, to try to convince someone. So he's got economic arguments. He's got military arguments why we should be independent. He's got political arguments. He's got religious arguments. There's a lot of argument back and forth about scripture. There's these intense arguments about the book of First Samuel and all that. And so we had some conversations that were really wonderful in the class about which parts of these arguments do we think still kind of have traction and which ones don't. And of course, the students came down in lots of different places about that, but it's a deep, and Paine, even Paine's deism, for which he becomes sort of a pariah from so many people, was in his view deeply grounded in his belief in God. He was very critical of organized religions of various kinds, but he never wavered. He says the creation is the Bible. So he has this very clear view that he believes firmly in God, but not in all of the institutions that have risen up over. So I think this was very much. It's a great question, like all of these have been. That doesn't have a simple answer, but it's definitely something that we had on our plate throughout the semester.
Arnav and then Jerry, any reactions for you?
Yeah, something I will say and something which comes to mind is I remember after one class having a conversation with Professor Murphy and honestly just telling him, isn't the language in Common Sense a little bit dramatic? And and he looked at me, he was like, yeah, it is very dramatic, and because he's trying to convince a lot of people of this seemingly radical idea. And it kind of hit me then that, again, like I mentioned before, when you try to approach this exhibit with kind of not thinking about what happened and how the result ended up, um, we kind of have that hindsight. And Jerry mentioned as well that the sentiment started to shift a little bit when you started taking polls throughout the semester about who people thought was most convincing. Um, and so I think we have the benefit of stability and seeing how things turned out and kind of, viewing every source from like a 30,000 foot view. Um, so I think, he might not, he wasn't as convincing as maybe some people expected him to be when viewing him now. Which brought up a lot of very interesting discussion. And so I just wanted to share that little anecdote from the semester.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Jerry, what about you?
Yeah, I think everyone else has covered most of what I wanted to say, but I think if Thomas Paine were to be in today's world, he would still be a reformist, because this is something that we talked over and over about in class, but he was very loud proponents of simple governments. I think if he were to be teleported to today's society, that would be the most critical stance that he takes, right? Today's government is too complex. There's too many laws. There's too many procedures and layers of bureaucracy. So I think in that sense, he would still be trying to reform government into the idealized version where he talks about people sitting under a tree and just talking about societal issues together.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And thank you again to Andy and to Arnav and to Jerry and to Emmy for joining us. This was a really important and big collaboration for the library. And we hope that you all have a chance either to view the exhibit online, which Anne has already dropped the link in the chat, but you can also find it very easily by going to the Clements website, or please make your way into the library and come see it in person. We'd be excited to walk you through it and make sure that you can see the fruit of all of this labor in the beautiful Avenir Foundation Reading Room. So thanks to everybody. Have a great weekend. And we'll see you next month for another episode of The Bookworm.